Well, thanks for having me on your show, Jeremy. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about Billion Dollar Hippie, the new BBC documentary, and really, kind of explain what it's all about and the perspective that they really took to talk about Steve. So, without further ado, I should continue. I'll start off by saying that the movie started out. It started out on a strong note because it shows a different side of Steve at the beginning. It talks about how he went to India and he actually took psychedelic drugs, and he went on sort of this whole hippie stage kind of thing, and he wanted to look at things from a different perspective, look at reality from a different perspective, essentially. So, but hippies didn't actually appreciate computers and technology. They looked at computers and those kind of machines as like big businesses used them to control the masses, sort of thing. And Steve Jobs wasn't that sort of way. Even though he was a hippie, he had toyed with electronics as a child, so that kind of gave him an edge when it came to the way he looked at electronics. He looked at big businesses like the way to change the world. So if he was going to change the world, that's how he was going to do it. He wanted to build his own company and do things the way that he wanted to do. He wanted to innovate. Even if you're not always inventing, he wanted to innovate, which is what they actually did with the mouse. Later on throughout the movie, they talk about how they had to innovate and, well, just to stay ahead of the competition, essentially. But really what they did was they took an old version of the mouse and they actually met up with a neighboring company in Silicon Valley. And they had some great ideas, but the company was too small and they couldn't get a patent on anything. So yeah, so basically Steve Jobs told them that they were sitting on a gold mine. So they took those ideas and they came out with an accessible mouse that made things, that changed the game, that changed the industry, the way that personal computers were accessible. So Jobs actually was still in school when, like at the beginning, when he met with Wozniak. He was at a computer. He had an after school job where he was at a computer company in Silicon Valley where he actually met Wozniak, and they clicked off really well. Wozniak states because Jobs had previously worked at HP, and Wozniak knew a little bit about electronics, so they kind of clicked off. And later on, Jobs actually got asked to make an Atari game with which Wozniak spent a great deal of time working on, and they were supposed to split the money 50-50, but Wozniak states that that wasn't the case. It's actually quite interesting. You learn a lot. It clears a lot of controversy up throughout the movie about just certain things and rumors that you might have heard about Steve Jobs, or the story you might have known might not always have been true. Like, for example, the beginning when they talk about taking psychedelic drugs in India and stuff like that, that is not what I heard. Before I seen the movie, I heard that Steve Jobs was actually experimenting with drugs in his garage with Wozniak, which I know now to be untrue, because he actually didn't even know Wozniak at the time that he was experimenting with all of these psychedelics and sort of things. So it's really kind of interesting when you touch on those kind of facts. Different sides of Steve, right? You look at Steve like, oh, he's this billion-dollar man, right? He's worth so much, and he's innovated so much technology. He's come out with the iPad, the iPhone, the Mac, the iPad, everything, the iPod, all that sort of stuff. He's really come a long way, right? But you don't look at him like he would be that sort of hippie type, like he would be down to earth, but he really was. And you'll see that throughout the movie. You see a different sort of characteristic come out. Well, you don't actually encounter many scenes where you see Steve Jobs in them. However, his friends and family paint quite the picture for you. His coworkers, his people that he's known very closely, they will paint the picture very vividly for you. I didn't know Steve Jobs for the man that he was, I should say. I watched a few videos on YouTube. I've heard things people have said about him, but I've never actually witnessed this sort of kind-heartedness that he's got inside of him. The movie changed a lot from my perspective. Around the turn of the century, consumers bought much more electronics, right? Walkmans, Discmans, all that sort of stuff. and Apple began working on the iPod, which I had no idea. I thought the iPod only came out years and years after, like, maybe 2005, maybe 2006. I mean, I didn't have that much background knowledge. However, it is kind of interesting to see that it did come out around the same time that MP3 players were very popular. I mean, MP3 players weren't necessarily a new thing, and the iPod, all it was an MP3 player, but nobody had thought of making it look nice, which I thought was extremely interesting. The fact that Steve wanted to change things, he wanted to make things look very professional, sleek. He wanted people to want that. He wanted people to want to use an iPod. Another thing that I thought was interesting was that when Apple went public in 1980, it was the most subscribed offering of shares since Ford Motors in 1956, worth nearly $2 billion at the age of 25. I mean, that is very successful, if you ask me. Steve did a lot of things that he set out to do. He had goals, and he finished them. He wasn't necessarily taken serious as chairman, though. And years later, Steve Jobs was actually kicked out of his own company, which it makes it sound like it was this big, devastating thing. However, it actually, in turn, towards the end of the movie, you'll start to see things fold out the way they were meant to be. And Steve even mentions in his commencement speech that he does not have one regret whatsoever. That everything has worked out the way it's supposed to be. That you can't always connect the dots forward. You can only connect them backwards. So to me, I mean, it's really, this movie was actually very inspirational for me. The fact that he persevered. I mean, with IBM at the beginning, IBM was their biggest competitor at the beginning. They were tearing them up. They had no chance really unless they came out with something so great and that could blow IBM out of the water. I mean, and then they started competing by making things. They made things that people wanted to buy. They had the iMac, which comes out. It wasn't like, it was expensive. However, it looked beautiful. You could see inside of it, which is what Steve had wanted. People can see his work. How he made everything so neat. He organized the wires and the circuit boards and everything to make it look so sleek in design. The iMac was also called the iMac, which is something I didn't know. It was called the iMac because the I stood for internet. It was actually very easy to get on the internet with the iMac. So they made it. They wanted to make their things interpersonal rather than personal, and it kind of, to me, this show, it changed things. It changed things for me. I was more of a PC kind of guy, but now I look at things from a different perspective because I see what Apple wanted to do. It makes sense to me now. They want things to be easy. They want it to be organized. They want, even down to the typography of the like the fonts that they use on the Mac OS. Like, it's actually very, very interesting, and I believe that anybody who knows what Apple is should go and see this movie. I mean, even if you have a decent background of Steve Jobs and you know a lot about the story, I mean, it's still a very, very interesting topic, and it's a very interesting movie to watch. You're going to see a lot of things dealing with technology from a different side of things. I mean, you look at Microsoft as the huge giant from the 90s, late 90s anyways, and you thought they were taking over and stuff, but you have no idea what goes on in the background. All this other sort of stuff just kind of fades out. We don't see, from the consumer side, we don't see a lot of what goes on behind the shelves, behind these products. But I mean, this movie kind of provides an insight to that, and I did appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk about that. So without, that's all I'd really like to say. If you happen to have an extra hour to spare, and you have internet, go on your computer, and I would search a $1 Billion Hippy, the BBC documentary. It is a very, very interesting movie. And thank you, Jeremy, for having me on your show. Have a good night.